All right, welcome to Comparative World Religions. This is the second chapter of Invitation to World Religions about indigenous religions of North America. We're going to be looking at more than just North American indigenous groups, but it's important for us to recognize that our those in the United States and North America, indigenous groups have been here for quite some time. When they were first recognized by the what they would call civilized world, and I'm sure indigenous people would take offense to that, and rightfully so. But nonetheless, when people were starting to come over from Europe, they gave them a name, and they named them Indians, thinking that they were from India. Untrue. They didn't know any different. But the name has stuck, and so they're North American Indians. A lot of times we hear that. Nonetheless, indigenous groups lived here in America for hundreds of years, and we're going to look at that. And I encourage you to read this chapter on your own, and get out your worksheet and fill in the blanks as you read and as you listen to this video. Ancient religions are often called indigenous. They have other names as well, like traditional, aboriginal, tribal, maybe non-literate, primal, native, oral, basic. There's all sorts of names. And we have a depiction of a few different ones in the pictures. As we go on, we recognize several terms that are important, and we'll be looking at a few of these. The first of which is found on page 32. It's the axis mundi. It's kind of the center of the world for at least the North American indigenous groups. Often seen as a cottonwood tree, the center of a dance, kind of the center of the world sort of idea, center of reality when they're doing their thing around it. The tree is planted in the earth, and it reaches to the sky, and it's kind of the idea that really brings them to their religious activity that they're doing, whether it be in a dance. They have all sorts of dances the North American indigenous peoples do. And there's a rain dance, there's sun dance, there's eagle dancer, and there's many others. And during these dances and during other times, they have what would be called a sacred time. Now, sacred time may not just be, it isn't just during the dances. It might be during birth. Sacred time might be during, the awakening of the sun or the setting of the sun. Or it could be making something, creating life. Sacred time might be the months that a woman is pregnant. Sacred time may be birth or marriage or consummation of marriage. It's considered sacred to many peoples. Sacred to see, to have growth of a crop and to harvest that crop. There are other things that may be sacred, and the time of sacred isn't firmly established. But certainly our life and the time that we have living as indigenous peoples would recognize it is sacred. And there's a time after that, maybe a time before that, would be considered sacred by others. It's a little elusive, but that gives you some ideas. There's a picture on the upper left that some would recognize it's sacred to see this kind of never firmly planted rainbow after a rain. It's could be a time, but nonetheless, it's not necessarily the time of the day at 2 o'clock is a sacred time, but an event of sorts. And time is seen different by most indigenous peoples. They don't have a time schedule of noon we have to eat and at 6 o'clock you get off work. Um, it's kind of loose, and I'll leave it at that. Sacred space is not so loose. It's very specific. They see a sacred space as very special, a place where no one other than in a certain time or a certain person should go to. I don't know if you know this, but most, say, Indian burial grounds are not mowed. I have had the privilege to be able to participate and deliver messages to a couple Cheyenne friends of mine in Oklahoma. The funeral didn't start anywhere on time, and it ended when they wanted it to end. But they had a wake the whole night before, and they gave away gifts for those that participated and those they cherished. And I was honored to receive a blanket from the family. But a sacred space isn't necessarily a house, or it certainly is for a burial place. The sacred space might be a tree, might be a totem pole, it might be a place where they live or where they do certain things. That could be movable, a transient. But sacred spaces and places for them, for the indigenous groups, vary, and one needs to learn their particular way of doing things. In Mesa Verde, Colorado, they would consider this probably sacred in a lot of ways now, but this is just a picture I've taken from above looking down where the people used to live and for a couple hundred years, and they built homes, lived here, and grew corn up above on the field in the fields until the weather changed enough where they couldn't grow corn anymore, or at least they suddenly moved and just left their houses, left their place of living, and just disappeared. With this, though, there have been some studies to figure out what exactly happened, and there are some good ideas of what probably happened. But what the picture is to help you understand, see that there's some building going on about 900 years ago that a lot of people would say, oh, there weren't any buildings here. And no, there were. Go all across the southwest of North America and find buildings of sorts. This is a kiva, and to the right is a place where they would go down, and they're not absolutely certain what happened here, but they think maybe there was a ceremony, a sacred ceremony for those in going through a ritual, having maybe a rite of passage, and maybe some smoking going on, or a small little fire. I mean, maybe people lived there, but these kivas have been rebuilt because the very first people that discovered some of these things didn't care about things, and they just loved to go through and destroy. But nonetheless, this is what we have, and in the left one, the bigger one, there may have been other community ceremonies held in this kiva that's now covered by a bigger metal facility. The indigenous peoples of all around the world, including North America, have their different stories, their myths. And again, they aren't necessarily, the idea of myth isn't necessarily false, but they are stories that carry teachings and carry their traditions, carry their values and their understanding of where we came from and who we are. The holy wind brought us possibly life, or it brings us refreshment. The creators, it could have been more than one. Some believe it was just a single one. And there's a variety. We're talking in North America all the way from Mexico up through Canada. On page 32, you have several mentioned. I lived among the Ojibwa in northern Wisconsin. Chippewa is the English pronunciation of that, but Ojibwa was part of that. And lived among the Cheyenne and Arapaho and Apache in the western part of Oklahoma. And then there are stories in the Aztec people in Mexico. Quetzalcoatl, or something like that. Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is another way that's pronounced. But this is just a story of a leader and one who brought them success and a remarkable government and sharing with the people their progress in community. But there are very many different myth stories of this in the Aztecs of Mexico. One teaches that he helped creation. Another that he helped the people. And there are some uncertainties whether this was actually a person or a dragon or a feathered serpent, like a snake that had feathers. A strange but very popular myth throughout Mexico. Then this is the Popol Vuh, also stories about creation. It talks about the exploitation of their gods and the very first humans. You'll see on these pages from starting in page 36 on through, there are several different discussions. One of them about the changing woman, which is one that's on the quiz as well as on your worksheet. Art, music, and religion, kind of all inseparable from really what was part of their religious life, their way of life. It's kind of like all one. And it was hard to say what's distinctly religious and what was not. There are certainly some activities in this chapter. We're not able to just focus on the teachings and then the practices so much. Unfortunately, a lot of the indigenous peoples' history was destroyed when the white man came through and found these peoples and just tagged them as vicious, as unlearned people and unknown to their own goings on. They would take their stacks of beads and different things of beads that were actually their teaching, their books of history. And the Americans, or the white men, were more interested in just their stuff, and then they go sell them for nothing and just create havoc. They call them savages. But the reality of it was they loved art, they loved music, they had their own religion and social behavior. And that needs to be understood. And by studying this, I think we can get a feel for more of who they were, and in part what makes up the history of the place where we live now. In 1990, Native American Arts and Crafts Act was put into place. It's a federal felony to offer imitations as a product of Indian craftspeople. I found this interesting because some people would like to say, oh, here's an arrowhead, here, buy this, and it's something that they made. Or here is made, something, a facsimile of some artifact of American Indian history, and it's not, but it's illegal to make those things. I just thought it would be interesting for us to know that. They used masks. They had a lot of dances. There were calumets. The pipes that they smoked. They had stories, myths, chants, and costumes. Um, Both of my children received beaded footwear for gifts as they were infants from the people I mentioned. They also received other things, and I myself benefited from working with the people and learned this particular phrase or idea of some of the Indian people that assimilated well with the white men are still called and have been called apples because they're kind of red on the outside but white on the inside. And it's a dig against them to give up their past. And it's unfortunate that so many were forced to give up their past by taking their kids to schools and not letting them study the history of their own family and of their indigenous group. So there was conquest, there was colonization, and that was brought in by many Christians. Uh, they were they were trying to get to the people to understand from their perspective um, that they were going to hell and they wanted to change them. But many of the changes were done very, very poorly. They weren't given a choice at times. There was certainly conquest by a lot of people, and they weren't all Christians by any way. And they were colonized and just kind of run over. And then our own government stepped in and said, well, we'll give you lands and you can live on this property. And they would change that and were treated unfairly. But within the indigenous peoples, the rites of passage are varied. Some of the rites of passage are certainly giving birth, but to get from childhood to adulthood, they would go through certain activities. Some of them would be for maybe the men. They would be beat, or they would be put out in the woods for a couple days without any parent that the kid would know. But what they often didn't know is that the parent was actually just maybe several, maybe 50 yards away, just to make sure that their child would be safe. But the child did not know this. But the child would have to spend maybe 2 or 3 nights out all by themselves with just an egg or with just a small amount and learn how to survive and learn how to be alone. Marriage is a certain kind of rite of passage of its own way. And then for us today, for even Indians in America, retirement is kind of its own thing. And for some Eskimos, retirement age or the age of getting close to death, if they were weak, they would just let them go and let them freeze and walk on. But there are different kinds of rites of passage, and they aren't all bad. They're very interesting and could be and are fascinating studies of the way they did things for their religious and for their just way of life. The shaman. Again, our book does not mention these, the medicine men or the people who had visions for the people, gave direction. This is an important word to recognize for other groups besides just the indigenous groups of North America. But there were often religious leaders. Might have been called shaman, may have had other names, but were intermediaries between what we can see and what we're not sure is out there in the spirit world. And that's what they were doing. And often they would pray for these people or do certain things or sprinkle certain kind of things on them. They used peyote at times to help and to get people to have visions and different things, but to understand that they were kind of the intermediary between the two, and the intercessor between the spirit world and the material world. Kind of a psychologist, a doctor, so-called, sort of person. So they used divination. Some did, some did not. Still some do in other indigenous religious groups around the world. And I'm not just focusing on the North American religions here, but I want to help us understand that these kinds of shaman or medicine men or diviners want to help with the people that are sick, and they're calling upon the spirit world to give them strength and health. But at any rate, they also feel like there's a predetermined future that they can figure it out, and they look for different, or with different powers, to figure different things out. So why study religion at all? We might ask the questions, who started it? What are the practices? Where do they come from? What's the purpose of life? Where are we going when we die? Does anything happen? So we study religions, and some people practice them just because that's what their parents did. I would challenge anyone, any religion that they're part of, to ask questions, to get information, and to move forward. You might do it on your own because you want to have some insight. You want to have some appreciation for what's going on. You want some intellectual clarity. You might enjoy the arts. I enjoy traveling, and I've been to a lot of different places for fun and for faith, and to study, to get some insights. So these are some different reasons, possibilities one might study religion. Indigenous peoples are under threat all around the world, not just in America or North America. But due to these four things, there's global spread of pop culture, and it's not just music. It has to do with some of the internet things that are just pop culture, things that people love, and hey, let control them sometimes. At any rate, that spread is creating some problems. The loss of natural environments. There's the loss of their language. And proselytizing is another one that's the threatening the indigenous people. Proselytizing means that I'm trying to get you to change from yours to mine, whether it's from Judaism to Christianity, or from Christianity to Islam, or from Islam to Buddhism. Whoever may be doing that. Some religious groups, and I'll just be upfront, Christians and Muslims both have the strongest groups of proselytizing others, and there's reasons for that, and we'll get into it later. But there are some reasons that the indigenous groups are growing smaller and smaller. And the loss of a traditional language is one of the reasons I wanted you to do a summary of one of the videos I've asked you to watch. Out of, I don't know, 20,000, I think, Cherokee Indians, there are only 5,000 or less actually speak the language. So even in America, or even in their own culture, they're not using their language from their culture. So that's threatening their history and their future. So here's the video that I wanted you to look at, and it's online. And go ahead and do the worksheet and look at the other assignments. And I'll see you next week as we start off in Judaism.